Good evening and Happy New Year to everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our first Watching the Moon program of 2021. And by way of explanation, Watching the Museum stands for Watching the Museum of Old Newbury, and it's our new slogan for our virtual programs. We're going to be doing about 2 programs a month. Next week, we will be welcoming best-selling author Eric J. Dolan, who's going to take us through an evening of the golden age of American piracy. But tonight we have another treat in store. Some of you may remember that our good friend and historian Jack Santos did a Newburyport Travelogue Part 1 in December. And tonight we have in store the Newbury Travelogue Part 2. Jack is going to take us across the pond and around the world and use his global travels to tell us about the lively and amazing stories of how Newburyport is connected to these far-flung places. So please join me in welcoming Jack Santos.
Well, thank you so much for having me back here at the Museum of Old Newbury. It's a delight to tell you a little bit about some of the travels I've been on and how they relate to Newburyport and Newburyport history. I'm Jack Santos, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here again for part 2 of a Newburyport travelogue. Part 1 spent our time a little closer to home, mostly on the east coast of the U.S. We're going to go a little further afield in this part 2. And for those of you that didn't attend part 1, let me just kind of recap what this is all about. Others vacation where we live. We plan our vacation about where we live. And the question I always get when I decide to go someplace and explore a little piece of Newburyport history away from Newburyport is, where do you start? And sometimes it's a place that you're already planning on going to, and you find out a little bit about Newburyport history. Sometimes it's a place where that Newburyport connection is actually a deciding factor. Or you can go there specifically for a part of Newburyport history that you want to explore more. That's the sole purpose for that vacation, is to take that piece of Newburyport history with you and explore it further. And how to plan? Well, there's a lot of opportunities to plan. You can work with your destination area, like with their historical societies, their museums, even from locations and pictures on the internet, connections you may have with families and family and friends, or local tour guides that are accessible. And before you leave, don't forget, we've got a lot of resources here. The library, Newburyport Public Library, and its archival center is always a great place to start. Just so much information there. And then the wealth of knowledge at our local museums, like the Museum of Old Newbury or the Custom House Maritime Museum. Don't forget to explore those as well. And most importantly, when you're on vacation, even if it's not just a Newburyport history vacation, you need to stay open to the unexpected. Look for those moments of serendipity. Aha, something that you didn't know about Newburyport that suddenly pops up in that location that you're visiting. And I'll give you a little bit of a pro tip that I've used in my world travels: geocaching.com. Yes, www.geocaching.com. If you go there, you'll find a wealth of information about a kind of a treasure hunt approach to visiting places afar. And in those places, you can also explore things and history and maybe even Newburyport connections that even the locals don't know about. So that's always a kind of an interesting approach, is to take advantage of this world of geocaching. So let's get started. Yes, the whole world is our oyster. And let's start our part 2 of our travelogue with two peoples separated by a common language, the land that we fought to get away from almost 200 years ago. Yes, we're going to go to London, England, the United Kingdom, and we're going to talk about Jacob Perkins. Jacob Perkins, which he was a Newbury's favorite and most famous inventor. He invented a machine for making heads on nails, machining nails, which up till that time it was children that hammered out those heads on nails before they used them for building houses or ships. He's also very famous for inventing a way to counterfeit proof money, paper money. He did it with a steel form, and he did it in this building here, which is today owned by the Museum of Old Newbury. Yeah, you've probably been in it. We have exhibits in there now, and other events. When of course we're not in this COVID type of lockdown. But yeah, the Museum of Old Newbury owns Jacob Perkins' factory where he created many of his inventions. I like to think of this as kind of a garage where he started his business, since it is kind of a garage-like building in the back of Fruit Street. Um, he beat Hewlett and Packard to being a garage business, almost 150, 200 years later, out in California, here in Newburyport. Because one of the other things that you may not know about Jacob Perkins is that he's known as being the father of the refrigerator. He didn't have the idea for a refrigerator. That came from Oliver Evans, who was another American inventor. Evans conceived it in 1805, but he never invented it. Perkins was granted the first patent for a vapor compression refrigeration cycle. He did that in 1835, and he titled it An Apparatus and Means for Producing Ice and in Cooling Fluids. Yes, Jacob Perkins, multi-talented, but he moved from Newburyport and went to London. He continued inventing there, and he's most famous for this penny black stamp, the world's first adhesive postage stamp. Yes, that was a Jacob Perkins invention while he lived in London. And when you go to London, a great place to find out more about the penny black stamp and Jacob Perkins is the London Postal Museum. That's first on our stop of our Newburyport Travelogue, the London Postal Museum in London, where you learn more about Jacob Perkins and Jacob Perkins, a former Newburyporter who lived in London and lived out his life there. Of course, when you're walking around London, you may, in fact, come across other pieces of Newburyport history just by serendipity. For instance, and this happened to me, I'm walking around going over to the Stamp Museum, and I see these signs. The Peabody Trust. This building on the left, the Horse Ferry Road estate of the Peabody Trust. It's Peabody Trust is the largest public housing trust in the United Kingdom. It provides affordable housing for thousands of people. But when I looked at that, I said, Peabody, I wonder if there's a connection of the Peabody Trust to Peabody, Massachusetts, to the Peabody Essex Museum, to the Peabody Institute. Well, in fact, I found out that there was. They are all related to this one man, George Peabody. Yes, George Peabody, who was born in South Danvers in 1795 in this house. South Danvers today is known as Peabody because it was named in honor, it was changed its name in honor of George Peabody. But South Danvers is not Newburyport. And the reason we're talking about him today is George Peabody lost his father at a young age. And he had a struggle to make a living. And around 1810, 1811, he came up to Newburyport to work in his brother's dry goods store as a teenager. And that's why he's in our talk. George Peabody of the Peabody Trust of the UK actually started his business career in Newburyport. You know, he was a pretty important guy. And we know that he was important because he was actually had 3 funerals. Yes, he was one of the few Americans to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but he was only buried there for a month. He was so highly regarded in England and the UK that they gave him the honors of being buried in Westminster Abbey. But he really wanted to be buried here in the States, so they exhumed his body, took him to Portland, Maine, where he had a second ceremony, a second funeral ceremony, and spent 3 days lying in state in Portland, Maine. And then he came down the coast from Portland, Maine, where he was finally laid to rest in Salem at the Harmony Grove Cemetery. It was a 96-day process. He was a great philanthropist, both on both sides of the ocean, and only one of 2 Americans ever to have been honored with the Freedom of the City of London, kind of the keys to the City of London. The other American was General Dwight D. Eisenhower many years later. A statue to George Peabody still stands in London's financial district, and in 1867 he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. There's a portrait of George Peabody in the Newburyport Public Library. Yes, that's it right there. If you're in the library, go look for the George Peabody portrait, because he was so impressed with Newburyport and his start in Newburyport that he came back and was one of the biggest donors to the new library. George Peabody gave $15,000 to the Newburyport Public Library. It was the largest gift, only to be equaled by William Todd's gift of $15,000, which was a lot of money in those days. Now, he was pretty wealthy. You may ask, how did he get so wealthy? George Peabody was a banker, and his partner was another name that you may recognize, Junius Spencer Morgan. They started a bank in London, became enormously successful. J.P. Morgan, Junius's son, was a banker here in the States, and you may have a personal relationship with the bank that George Peabody started. You may even be carrying a piece of George Peabody around with you. I know I am, because George Peabody's bank today is JP Morgan Chase, or Chase Bank. What's in your wallet? And another person we'll talk about that spent time both in Newburyport and London is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, who had family in Newburyport, he was known to have visited here, and he spent some time actually studying the effects of a lightning strike on the church in Market Square in 1800. So, yeah, that's Ben Franklin was a great Newburyporter by relation to his relatives that lived here, and he was born in Boston. Spent most of his time in Philadelphia, and spent a lot of time in London, England. In fact, the only house that remains that Ben Franklin lived in is on Craven Street in London. And that's another stop on our travelogue. If you happen to find yourself in London or in London on vacation, go to the Ben Franklin house on Craven Street. You won't regret it. It's been recreated to look like what it looked like when Ben Franklin lived there. And there are actors that will take you through the rooms and will act out the roles of servants or friends that visited him on Craven Street in London. But that's not the only aspect of London that has a Ben Franklin and Newburyport connection. You could go to the British Museum in London and look for this. Yes, it doesn't look like a lot, kind of shabby. It's a purse that Ben Franklin had, and he brought with him to London. He gave it to the founder of the British Museum, and to this day, it's in the British Museum, sometimes on view, sometimes in the archives. Sir Hans Sloane, his friend, bought this purse from Ben Franklin. And the reason we're talking about it today is that purse is made from asbestos. It's made from asbestos that was purported to be mined from Devil's Den in Newbury. Yes, that purse is made from asbestos from the rock in Devil's Den, which you can still walk to today. It's a nice little walk, and see rock there with asbestos in it. You know, it's a very fibery mineral that sticks out of the rock in Devil's Den. Devil's Den was originally a mine for calcite used in making mortar for bricklaying and other uses, but there's a piece of Devil's Den now sitting in the British Museum in London, courtesy of Ben Franklin. Another stop you have to make when you're in London. Another place to go to while you're in London that has a Newburyport connection is the National Gallery. The National Gallery on Trafalgar Square has a portrait of Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, and it was painted by Thomas Gainsborough. And the reason I'm bringing that portrait up in my talk today is you may have seen this portrait before without being in London. Yes, the British Vice Admiral Edward Vernon was the creator of the drink grog. And if you go to the grog today, you'll find a pretty good facsimile of that portrait that stands in the National Gallery next to the bar of that portrait of Admiral Edward Vernon. So we have a piece of London here in Newburyport at the grog. But while in London, go check out the original at the National Gallery. And finally, you know that when I often give talks, I like to bring in a little bit of the history of the Wheelwrights. They're kind of my favorite family to follow that lived here in Newburyport. And specifically, when I bring up Wheelwrights, usually people immediately think of William and Martha Wheelwright. Yes, William and Martha Wheelwright, who William established the Wheelwright Scientific School Scholarship at Newburyport High School, still given today, still highly regarded. And they also established, Martha Wheelwright established the Wheelwright Home for Aged Females. It was this house up on High Street that was the Wheelwright Home for Aged Females. Today, it's a private residence, but the intent lives on in the Newburyport Society for the Relief of Aged Women that gives out awards to women in need here in Newburyport. Yes, William and Martha Wheelwright, famous here in Newburyport, lived on High Street for many years in this home, but they also lived in London. Yes, he was pretty wealthy. And he spent a lot of time in London as well as other places in the globe, which we'll see in just a moment. But while you're in London, you could take a little walk from Trafalgar Square up to Regent's Park. And in Regent's Park is where William and Martha Wheelwright lived, specifically at Gloucester Gate off of Regent's Park. It's a nice place. Regent's Park's a wonderful place to take a walk. And also, you'll get to see homes at Gloucester Gate that were probably the types of homes that William and Martha Wheelwright lived in while they lived in London. But London wasn't the only place they lived in. William Wheelwright actually made his money in South America. Yes, Valparaiso, Chile is where William and Martha also lived. Valparaiso, why Valparaiso? Well, that's an interesting story. William Wheelwright was in command of the Rising Sun, a ship that was owned by William Bartlett over on Federal Street, and he shipwrecked it in Argentina. And in a classic story of making lemonade out of lemons, once he was shipwrecked in Argentina, he saw what was needed down in South America, Argentina and Chile, and became their largest industrialist. Oh, by the way, that ship he shipwrecked that William Bartlett owned, well, William Bartlett was his future father-in-law. He ended up marrying William Bartlett's daughter, Martha Garish Bartlett. So I guess it didn't entirely turn William Bartlett off to William Wheelwright, especially since he was so successful. He had railroads and steamships in South America. He was the a founder and owner of the Pacific Steam Navigation Company. He set up shop in Valparaiso, Chile. He was the first one to create a railroad between Argentina, Buenos Aires, and Valparaiso that went into the inland of Argentina and Chile. So very, very successful industrialist. So successful that they have a statue to him in the center of Valparaiso. So if you happen to go down to Chile or in the area like in Argentina, you might want to stop in Valparaiso, check out the statue of William Wheelwright. After all, many Chileans come up to Newburyport on an annual basis to see where William Wheelwright was born and lived. That's how much they honor him down there. Now, William Wheelwright, while we're talking about William Wheelwright, there's one other aspect of it that's just absolutely astounding. He was the first person to think about putting a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Well, maybe he's not the first one to think about it, but he certainly presented the proposal in front of a meeting at the Royal Geographical Society in London, complete with maps and how to do it. That was in 1844, and that could be another stop on your world tour of Newburyport related sites because of William Wheelwright's connection to the Panama Canal. Of course, the Panama Canal, he may have thought about it, proposed it in 1844. It wasn't until 1881 that construction actually started, and it took the United States stepping in 1914 to finish it off. And today, you can take your cruise ship and go through the Panama Canal. And only recently, they've widened it to handle some of those super large cruise ships that are out cruising. Of course, we'll probably have to wait till this pandemic is over before we can get on another cruise ship. But my understanding is that could be just a few months away. Now, Wheelwright, I've talked about Abraham Wheelwright. Abraham Wheelwright was a Revolutionary War soldier, and he had a connection to the United Kingdom as well. There's a picture of Abraham taken around in the late 1840s. One of the few pictures of Revolutionary, of a few photographs of what Revolutionary War soldiers that we have. Yes, Abraham Wheelwright was after his time under Washington and Knox on land, became a privateer. And as a privateer, he was captured 3 times by the British and escaped 3 times from British jails. One of those jails was in the island of Bermuda, which is our next stop on our travelogue. Not a bad place to stop if you've never been to Bermuda. And this is one of those places where I specifically went to Bermuda to look for this building. Yes, this building was Abraham Wheelwright's jail while he stayed in Bermuda. Today, you can visit it on the outside. You're not allowed to go on the inside because it is the post office of St. George, Bermuda. Yeah, this is where the British, when they would capture privateers, one of the places that they would hold them in a jail, the jail in St. George's, Bermuda. Now, not only did I target Bermuda specifically to do research on Wheelwright. But I also, this is a little serendipity types of moments again. Taking the ferry around the island of Bermuda, I came across this crew. These folks ran the ferry between the St. George's and Hamilton. Believe it or not, after having a discussion with them while I was on the ferry to get to St. George's, that fellow, the tallest fellow in the back, he told me that he was kind of quasi-retired. He helped with the ferry, but his full-time job for most of his life was the history teacher at the high school. And so he gave me much more information. It was really helpful in terms of history of Bermuda and the history of Americans in Bermuda and privateers in Bermuda. Very knowledgeable guy. Just one of those wonderful moments that when you're traveling and you're doing some of this history research or trying to explore more about Newburyport's connection, you just never know when it's going to come up. And he actually introduced me to the woman in front who became my private tour guide at St. George's, and even brought more information to the forefront, and was really helpful during my stay there. Like, for instance, if you happen to be in St. George's, just around the corner from the post office, which was the jail, is the Bermuda National Trust Museum. A good place to stop, but it was a good reason to stop is that it was also the Confederate headquarters in Bermuda. Yes, there was a tight link between Bermuda that supported the Confederacy and the Confederacy of the United States of America, and their headquarters was in this building. There's still a lot of artifacts and interesting history that you may want to explore when you go to the National Trust Museum. And once you're done with St. George's, you can take the ferry across the island over to the Royal Naval Dockyard. Yes, the Dockyard was probably the UK's biggest naval installation in the Western Hemisphere. It's still there. They don't use it. It's a stop for cruise ships. That building in the middle of that picture is a museum there with a lot of really interesting artifacts. So there's a lot to do on Bermuda. It's a beautiful island. Hop, skip, and a jump. I understand we have cruises and flights, from Boston to get there pretty easily. And you can also explore a little bit of Newburyport history while you're there. So let's move on from Bermuda and now head west to the west coast of the United States. We're going to take Horace Greeley's advice and go west, young man. One way to go west was to go by wagon train, just like in the picture here. And one of the most famous wagon trains left Kansas City, headed to California. Sorry, folks. Something went wrong, but we'll start it up just again. Now you figured out that I actually am not doing this live. I'm doing this pre-recorded only because it's a little less hectic on our end, except when things like that happen, which is kind of surprising. So just give me a second, and we'll see if we can get this started again.
Jack, is there anything I can help you with? Or are you good?
No, we're good. We just
Okay.
have to, for some reason, it just stopped.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. But we'll pick it up where we left off.
Fast forward.
Exactly. Fast forward. Right at Horace Greeley. I hope everybody's enjoying this so far. Get questions in the chat as we go through this, because it we'll be able to answer it and talk about it. And if you've got any tips on places that you've gone to, we can share it then as well. West, young man. One way to go west was to go by wagon train, just like in the picture here. And one of the most famous wagon trains left Kansas City, headed to California, but they didn't make it. That was the Donner Party. And the Donner Party got stuck at Donner Pass in California. Part of the Donner Party, or the leader, George Donner, was married to Tamsin Eustace Donner of Newburyport. Incidentally, Tamsin's mother was Tamsin Wheelwright. She married George Eustace. They lived at 50 Milk Street. That house still stands. And Tamsin Eustace uh, 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 Donner was actually educated in the Newburyport Female Academy. She was well versed, well written, and just a smart lady. Moved to North Carolina, then up to Chicago, where she met George Donner, and then went on that infamous trip to Donner Pass, which is another great stop in our travelogue. And you can, but those, by the way, those pictures there, that's not Tamsin, that's Tamsin's daughter, Georgia and Eliza. They actually survived that harrowing incident in Donner Pass. Tamsin handed them off to some trappers that had come up and made it through the snows, and they got the girls out of there, and they lived very long lives. Here is a picture of the monument at Donner Pass. This picture comes to us from John Dodge. John, who lives locally, was there just a couple of years ago. Took some great photos. Thank you, John, for letting me use them. The snows were as high as this monument. And so it was a harrowing episode. Tamsin was one of the last people to actually be eaten in that incident of cannibalism. And we have a quote from Tamsin that is at that memorial up at um, up at Donner Pass. If I do not experience something far worse than I have yet done, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started. Kind of an interesting quote given what happened. Taking a wagon train wasn't the only way to get to California, and a lot of people from Newburyport ended up going to California looking for gold or farmland or a new life. And one of the ones that we're going to highlight today are the Ashby brothers, William and Mark Ashby. They lived at the corner of Kent and High Street. They left around 1848. They were induced by those, let's go and find gold. If they found gold, it wasn't really that much, but it did make enough for them so that they could buy land in California. They went to California via that Panama connection, although there was no canal at that point. They had to take a ship to Panama, get off, trek across the Isthmus of Panama, and then grab another ship to go to the west coast of California. Not an uncommon way to go there. The other way would be around the Horn of South America. But the Ashby brothers ended up in San Francisco, Oakland specifically. In fact, if you go to Shattuck and University Avenues, you would be in the middle of the Ashby's farm. It's all developed now because it was the Ashby's farmland that was developed into a subdivision, which they named the Newbury Tract, named for Newbury and Newburyport, Massachusetts. Ashby, it's easy to get there. Ashby Station is on BART today. So get into California, take the plane in, get on the BART, head over to Ashby Station, and you'll be in a piece of Newburyport. And that's the BART station today. But it didn't always look like that, of course. It was originally not called Ashby Station. It was called Newbury Station. Yes, when back in the days of streetcars and when the Ashby brothers started the Newbury Tract and started building the houses, those kinds of California bungalows in the lower right here, the original transit station was called Newbury Station in honor of Newbury and Newburyport. Amazing the kinds of connections that you can get by just looking around and following that thread from Newburyport to the world. So, pop quiz. Are you a Newburyport native? Because if you are, you'll get this right. How do you pronounce the word couch? Is it A, couch, B, cooch, or forget about it? It's all sofas. Yes, the right answer is B, cooch. And we're going to talk about Captain John H. Cooch. I love this photograph. You could just the pained expression on his face is kind of like, oh my gosh, I gotta take a picture, or it could be this tie. I never wear a tie. It's really bothering me. Or maybe he's thinking, get me out of here. I should be out at sea, doing what I do best. And his wife, yeah, I'm pretty sure I've had that same kind of expression. My wife has had that same kind of expression when I did something stupid. But oh yeah, I just love this picture of Captain Cooch. He was probably born at 54, around 54 Federal Street, but he lived in this house here at the corner of Washington and Court Street, and it's both houses still stand. This house in particular, but Captain Cooch was a captain who sailed ships for John Cushing, and he would often go to the West Coast, and he'd take the route, of course, around Cape Horn in South America, and then head up to the Northwest Territories, typically, and that's what he's famous for today. After a few trips to the Northwest Territories, which were in dispute at the time, right? The Great Britain thought they were theirs, the U.S. thought they were theirs, so he was kind of taking a risk moving into a territory and trying to establish himself in an area that was still disputed between two countries. Well, we know how that ended up. It became the states of Oregon and Washington. And Captain Cooch is known today as a founder of Portland, Oregon. Yes, Portland, Oregon was where Captain Cooch settled and established an outpost of 640 acres. Why would 640 acres? That's kind of an interesting number, because that's exactly the amount of acres that Newburyport, when it separated from Newbury, had. So I don't know if that's a coincidence, or Cooch did that deliberately, but his 640 acres eventually became Portland, Oregon. This is a picture of Cooch Park in the center of Portland. His monument that he's buried in Portland, in the cemetery in Portland, Oregon. It was called, the deed was Cooch's Edition, and it was really an area that Cooch became pretty famous for. It was one of the biggest, when he finally died, he had one of the biggest funerals in Portland up till that day. It was highly regarded in the Portland area. So definitely worth a visit to Portland, Oregon. Cooch in Cooch's Park in the center of Portland, and maybe even pay some respects to him at the cemetery. Captain John H. Cooch. You know, a lot of Newburyport captains took that same trip around the Horn, but they didn't quite make it, and many stopped off the coast of Peru. And that's our next stop in this travelogue. You may think that it's really cool and she to go to the Galapagos, but you know, the Galapagos, that's old news. It's crowded. A lot of ships go there. They're worried about the impact on the environment. Where you want to go is where our Newburyport captains went to, and that's the Chincha Islands. Yeah, never heard of the Chincha Islands? Neither did I. Now, I didn't end up going there, but I will tell you that I first heard of them when I was down in the Newburyport Library Archival Center, and Sharon Spilden brought over a photograph and said, Jack, take a look at this photograph. What's this all about? I said, wow, that's a lot of old white guys. But as it turns out, from a little further investigation, it was a portrait of captains that had visited headed the Chincha Islands. Now, we're not sure that they're all Newburyport captains. It may be much broader than that. But we are sure that there was a lot of trade going on with the Chincha Islands and much of it from Newburyport. And why would we be trading with these small set of islands off the coast of Peru? Because they were a huge supply of guano. Yes, guano. Well, you can only expect that as the United States was growing and all that farmland was happening in the Midwest, we needed a lot of fertilizer. And some of the best fertilizer in the world at the time came from the Chincha Islands. And that's why our Newburyport ships would go there, load up on the guano, and bring it back. Today, it's kind of an up and coming tourist attraction. So if you're really into those out of the way places that are hard to get to, put the Chincha Islands on your list and do some more research on how Newburyport was a part of its success as the world's leading guano producer. Now, there's two other people I want to introduce you to that headed west as well, and that's Gilbert Watson and W.R. Kilburn, Captain Kilburn of the brig Henry. Gilbert Watson was a member of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows here in Newburyport. We had a big Odd Fellow chapter in Newburyport, and Gilbert decided that he wanted to start an Odd Fellow chapter in Oregon City. Yes, he convinced the Newburyport chapter and the Massachusetts Independent Order of Odd Fellows to give him a charter that he would bring out to Oregon City, establish himself, and start a chapter of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. You can see that was in 1846. Gilbert Watson sailed from Newburyport, and there was a lot of activity going on the West Coast during that time because of the gold rush. California, Sacramento, San Francisco, Eureka, and Salem, they all started Odd Fellow chapters. Gilbert Watson never made it to Oregon City. You'll see that there's no list here for Oregon City getting started because he actually went up the West Coast of South America, and they got caught in a storm. And that storm blew them so far off course that they ended up in Hawaii and never left. Yes, Honolulu, Hawaii. Captain Kilburn and Gilbert Watson landed in Oahu, and there they took that charter that was supposed to be the charter to start an Independent Order of Odd Fellows chapter in Oregon City. They started it here in Hawaii. So if you go to Honolulu and stop in at the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, especially if you are an odd fellow, then they will welcome you with open arms because he's still revered there as the person who started the Independent Order of Odd Fellows chapter in Honolulu, Hawaii. You may actually, walking around Honolulu, feel at home because if you look at the churches, they're kind of out of place. They look very much like the kind of Episcopalian church architecture we have here in New England. And there's a reason for that. Because there were a lot of people from New England, specifically from Boston, that ended up going to Hawaii and settling Hawaii, primarily to try to convert the natives. But in doing so, they established these churches. And while you're in Honolulu, Hawaii, I would highly recommend taking a walk around, looking at the churches, looking at the architecture. And if you're feeling homesick, you'll feel right at home. There's one other spot, and this is kind of an interesting story. At my last talk, Maureen Daly pulled me aside and said, have you ever been to the Bishop Museum in Honolulu? I said, no, I missed that. I wasn't able to get there while I was there. Here's a picture of the Bishop Museum. If it looks familiar to you, yes, it should. Yeah, the Bishop Museum, again, following all those expats from Boston and New England, was of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. You know, Henry Hobson Richardson from Boston created this really first American styled architecture. And it's similar to the architecture at the Old South Church in Boston. But for all you old time Newburyporters, you may also remember the YMCA on State Street. That's where the library is now, and built from the same Richardsonian Romanesque architecture, the same design. And if you need to be reminded about those arches and what they look like and get a little bit of flavor of what it looks like in Hawaii, just go down to Metzi's Cantina, because when the MCA burnt down, they took a piece of those arches, used them for what was then the new train station, now a restaurant over at the train station. That's Metzi's, and you can see the arches that were incorporated into the building design. There's just so many connections of Newburyport to the world, and we've only scratched the surface. But what better way to end than in beautiful Hawaii? Yes, it's the middle of winter here in New England, but just dream about those beautiful beaches, the Hawaiian shores that we've just visited and found out more about Newburyport there. But let's recap all the other places we visited, including London, Gloucester Gate at Regent's Park, the British Museum, where we saw Ben Franklin's purse, Ben Franklin's house, the Stamp Museum, learned more about Jacob Perkins, and all those public housing sites that George Peabody helped establish. We hopped over to Bermuda to look at the jail that Abraham Wheelwright was held in, and then South America, that statue of William Wheelwright in Valparaiso, Chile, the Chincha Islands, the Panama Canal, and then over to the West Coast, Donner Pass in California, Oakland, California, where we stopped at Ashby Station, then called Newbury Tract, Portland, Oregon at Couch Park, and finally Hawaii, where we visited churches, the Oddfellows Lodge, and the Bishop Museum. But there's a lot more in the world still to be found about Newburyport, and I'm going to challenge you to give it a go. You can go to the Caribbean, Barbados, one of our biggest trading partners, St. Eustatia, which was an island that was the first to recognize the young United States as a country and home to many a Newburyport privateer. Antigua, which has jails still in existence that held Newburyport privateers. Or closer to home, go up to Quebec City, through the Maine backwoods, follow the steps of the Arnold Expedition. You may have heard me talk about that before, where Benedict Arnold left Newburyport with 1,100 men and tried to conquer Quebec as a 14th colony. Or visit Gettysburg, honor the Newburyport fallen. Baltimore, where Garrison lived and had his printing office while he established his stand in being anti-slavery. And then finally, China. We haven't even touched China, where Caleb Cushing was an ambassador and spent time in Hong Kong and Shanghai. But before you do that, I want to swear you in as official Newburyport volunteers. The camera's not on. It's just between us. So raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, your name, promise to become a member of the Museum of Old Newbury if I am not one already. I promise to travel the world even if the world is just 30 minutes from my home, and I promise to report back on interesting things about Newburyport's history and its connection to the world. So help me, Caleb Cushing. Congratulations. You're now an official Newburyport history tourist. And don't forget, wherever you go, go with all your heart. So that ends my prepared remarks. Let's open it up to Q&A, and more importantly, I want to hear where you've been and connections that you found about Newburyport around the world. Thanks for your attention.
Jack.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Well done. But where's that Hawaiian shirt? You are a quick change artist.
I completely forgot I ended with the Hawaiian shirt on. I had my jacket, and Bob Watts called me. I said, "Oh, you don't have the same clothes on." But well.
That's so awesome. Hey, so actually, speaking of Bob Watts, he is one of your first questions. That photograph of Abraham Wheelwright, was that taken by Henry Perkins, perchance?
Well, that's a very good question. I kind of doubt it. I think by that photograph was taken like in around 1845. Wheelwright died in around 1850, and so it was just a few years before his death. And we had a lot of photographers. We were a hotbed of photography. There were at least 2 or 3 on State Street, 1 or 2 on Pleasant. So I suspect it could have been somebody
And Jack,
else.
aren't we still? We got Bob
Still a
Watts.
hotbed.
We
Yeah.
got Dan Fiante. I mean, we got some great. Brian Eaton just recently retired from the Daily News. We have some amazing photographers.
We do. Yeah. And I mean, you look at all the old pictures and you'll see all the photographic studios. It was, it was Haverhill where they invented the amber type. Everybody knows about, was it a daguerreotype?
I always daguerreotype. Thank you.
Right.
I always say it wrong.
Everybody knows about the daguerreotype, but they forget that we kind of even, expanded on that and did this thing called ambrotype, which was a very popular way of photographing people about that time. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it could have been, but I could be somebody else. There's a whole list of them. I'm sure Bob knows them better than I do.
All right, we got another question. Sally Chandler, one of our favorite Yeet Yeet Don't Tell Me participants. She asked, did you say that Mrs. Donner survived or just her children?
No, just her children. Yeah, just the children. That's kind of an interesting story. God bless her, Tamsin. She they were they were isolated, stranded at the Donner Pass, but people were still able to get to them. You don't hear much about that, and I know we've got some Donner experts in town, but
Right.
and they may want to chime in. But people were still getting to them, and Tamsin Donner actually handed the 3 children, it was 2 girls and a boy, I believe, over to a couple of trappers who made it to them. But something about the trappers, she said to herself, something's not right. So she followed him, and 2 miles away discovered her children left by the trappers. She had paid the trappers to take the children out, and they decided to take the money and leave the kids to die in the wilderness. She saved the kids, brought them back. Another set of trappers made it up. They got the kids out. She stayed with her sick husband, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. And then Emily Hoffman, another awesome participant in Yeet Yeet Don't Tell Me. She asks, was Abraham Wheelwright the uncle to William Wheelwright?
Yeah, I neglected. Hey, Emily, thanks for pointing it out. Yeah, that was William's uncle. Abraham's brother was Ebenezer. They were in business together for a long time. Ebenezer also lived up on High Street, and William was Ebenezer's son. So he was William's uncle. Everybody knows about William. William was very famous, and if you go into Oak Hill Cemetery, he's just got an absolutely incredible tombstone.
Wow.
Burial site there. But in addition to the other places that he lived, I don't think they have any burial grave sites for him there. But besides the statue in Valparaiso, but yeah, no, he was a nephew. And there's a bunch of the Wheelwright story is fascinating. I could go on for hours. I probably should give another talk on the Wheelwrights because there's a lot of them that have had a big impact.
We're coming up on 7:55, almost a full hour, but here's my question to you. Can you give us the Jack Santos synopsis of the Wheelwrights? in about 3 minutes?
Oh yeah, no, I'll do it. Yeah, probably less than 3 minutes. I want to bore the heck out of people. It's a running joke in
No,
my
come on.
house that if you come and visit us or you're here for dinner or something like that, I'll bore you for 3 hours with Wheelwright stuff. But yeah, no, actually, John Wheelwright was one of the original pastors that came over. He was specifically brought over to help pastor to the Puritans, and he is buried today in Salisbury. His Abraham, a branch of the family, they mostly stayed up in Maine and Wells. John and moved. John was Anne Hutchinson. Remember Anne Hutchinson?
Yes, I do.
John was Anne Hutchinson's brother-in-law, and they actually brought John over to kind of calm Anne Hutchinson down because she was saying things that the establishment didn't want to hear, and John actually did a 180 and supported her, and they decided to banish both John and Anne. John moved up to Wells, Maine. Most of the family lived up in Wells, Maine, but there was a branch of the family that came down here to Newburyport. That was Abraham and Ebenezer.
Okay.
And yeah, so and they had a big impact. It's I could like I said, I could go on for 2 or
Well,
3
I know the
hours.
Wheelwrights are near and dear to your heart. Is there anything else you want to share with us, Mr. Santos?
Yeah, I think I can't impress on folks enough that this isn't anything special. It's you can do this yourself, and I'm always open to other ideas. As a matter of fact, we were discussing this before the show tonight. The just this morning in the paper, the history minute that the Museum of Old Newbury sponsors, there was another factoid about Hawaii. The governor of Hawaii was the grandson or great
Yes.
grandson of a Newburyport native. So it's like, boy, if I had known that, I would have worked that into the presentation.
And founded the Dole Fruit Company.
Yeah, which makes me wonder whether you can go over to Dole Pineapple and ask for free samples and say, hey, you got connections.
Well, I'm related, or
Right.
I'm with the band.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But there's just so much of that. It's amazing how such a small town that at the time was 10,000, 15,000 people
Right.
spread out to the world and the impacts that we've had. So it's I would definitely plan. I'm planning. I'm also already planning a vacation. Before COVID hit, I was going to go to Barbados to do research. They were a big trading partner. As it turns out, we're probably going to shift that. And just today, we made reservations for 2022 to go to one of the Caribbean islands and research Newburyport trading there.
And what with all the shipping and captains that are a part of Newburyport and have been so important, then I'm pretty sure that you'll find a connection in some fashion.
Well, they have historical societies
already, quite frankly.
Yeah, right. I mean, they have historical societies. So just as you can go into the Custom House or at the Museum of Old Newbury and pick up data about what they were sending down, the other end has data and information about what they received and what they were doing while they were down there. So I'm hoping to find out more about, especially about the Wheelwrights.
Yeah. Hey, Jack, we as always cannot thank you enough. You're my friend. You're my co-host on Yeet Yeet Don't Tell Me, and you are pretty special. On behalf of the Museum of Old Newbury, we're so proud to be watching the moon with you.
My pleasure. I'm honored to be able to do this. Can't wait till next week when Eric Dolan.
I know.
Isn't
that going to be fun?
Book.
Yeah, the 14th, I believe, right? Yes, the 14th. Yes, Black Waters, Blue Seas, Black Waters, Blue Water. I've seen it so many times I can't recall the name of it. I just see the pirate skull.
Arr, it's about pirates.
Arr. Dems who don't watch it'll be the lost ones. Jack, thank you. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you hopefully on the 14th. And hey, Jack, what are we?
We're history.
We're history. Good night, everyone.